All right. Welcome, Dr. Ali Wolpern, to the Solid in the Saddle podcast. We're so excited to have you today. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, you're welcome.
So,
So I'll just go ahead and introduce myself if you don't mind.
yeah, that sounds great. Tell us all about you.
My name's Allie Wolpern. I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in like a primary farming community. I ended up going and getting my bachelor's degree in Colorado in exercise science. And then I went on to do my master's and PhD, both at the University of Utah, where I focused on health, exercise, physiology, and disease. All of my research was kind of unique niche, and it was in urinary incontinence and pelvic floor disorders and how activity is influencing that or how those disorders are influencing their activity. So that was really fun. I took a lot of nutrition classes while I was there. After that, I got a job at the University of Montana Western, where I work right now. And I teach exercise physiology as well as basic human nutrition and an advanced sport nutrition class. Um, at the collegiate level. And my personal interest, so I'm 32 years old. I ran cross country and track throughout college. And post college, I did a lot of 50-mile trail races. I have some 50K trail races for the summer. I do a lot of backpacking where I'm doing like 20 to 30-mile days. And I try to do quite a bit of kayaking and rafting in the early spring months. So I'm mostly focused on endurance events myself. Um, but I am always interested and always have various college students ask me questions about pretty much every supplement possible.
Absolutely. They're obsessed with supplements. And I'm just so excited that we get to have you on the podcast because you are a wealth of information, not only, like you said, with your information on pelvic floor research and all of that, but all of the nutrition stuff that I'm so excited to cover with you today.
Yes, for sure.
So, today I wanted to focus on the supplement creatine. So, creatine is very heavily researched and also very heavily stereotyped. So, when I talk to women about creatine, especially my riders who are maybe like 40 to 60, um, they grew up in a time where creatine was only used by bodybuilders. And so I kind of want to talk about that today and break down those barriers. And if you could just give us kind of a overview about what creatine actually is versus what people think it is.
Yes, and I'm pretty sure that definitely still exists today. Like I'm pretty sure if you walk into any high school classroom, I'm sure majority of the males will be taking creatine. They will have no idea why they're taking it, but they definitely will. It's definitely very targeted towards like young males.
Hmm.
Um, so much. And pretty much every male college student I ask, most of them are like, I don't know why I take it, I just do.
Yeah.
So I completely agree. I'm going to preface this by saying I don't personally take creatine, and I'll explain the reasons why I don't personally take it currently in my life later on. But I just wanted to preface that just to make it a little bit more interesting. But creatine is interesting. So, creatine is made up of amino acids, but it's not a protein, which is kind of unusual. So, amino acids make up proteins, but creatine is a non protein that makes up amino acids. So, obviously, if you're consuming protein, especially from animal products, you're going to be consuming amino acids that then help form the creatine. So what creatine does, so we're going to go back to some basic biology. All of us in our muscles have phosphocreatine stores, which is a very long word. But we all have some amount of phosphocreatine stores. And basically, what happens when we are either consuming creatine in foods or creatine supplements is we're trying to increase these baseline phosphocreatine stores that are in the muscles. So we all have a baseline value. It's obviously going to change. So if you have one week where you're sick and you're not consuming very much food at all, or you have really low protein intake that week, your phosphocreatine stores are going to go down, which is ideally what we don't want to happen. So what do we do with these phosphocreatine stores? We use these to create energy. So phosphocreatine is used to create ATP or our energy source. So basically, when we use up our phosphocreatine stores, that's when we start to get tired when we're exercising. And this usually occurs 5 to 10 seconds after a high intensity activity. So obviously, all of the rodeo events are short and high intensity. So you're
Hmm.
using a lot of your phosphocreatine stores specifically in that activity. When the fatigue sets in, definitely, obviously, 3 seconds is different from 10 seconds, especially with rodeo events. And a lot of that is dependent on like intensity. So, depending on the intensity within the event or activity that you're doing, is going to change when that fatigue sets in and how much phosphocreatine you use up. And then your baseline values are going to be different. So obviously, rodeo seasons can be long. You can travel to southern states to compete in rodeos all year, which is where you'd really want to look at those baseline phosphocreatines, especially if you're like eating on the road and traveling and having all of that.
Mhm.
Because that could greatly impact it. But with creatine is we're looking to like maximize those baseline stores of phosphocreatine so that we can then create energy very, very quickly and hopefully have that fatigue set in at like 8 seconds instead of 2 seconds and thus
Okay.
improve your performance.
hmm So, in addition to helping you build muscle, it really is a performance enhancing
Yeah.
supplement.
Yes, I would say it's definitely performance enhancing. It's not like illegal by any means, but it definitely has a lot of connections to performance. There's been lots of studies looking at that, like in lab settings, like on treadmills, bikes, because cycling is a really easy way to look at power
hmm
across all sports, even if you're not a cyclist. So it's basically your ability to like increase your capacity to do like really fast, hard work in those like really short second bursts.
hmm Okay. And I do have a side note for our audience. So last year when I started taking creatine, I did research on creatine in horses because I wanted Gracie to be on creatine. I was like, hey, if we both are trying to build muscle, I want her to be on it. And unfortunately, it doesn't work in horses like it does in humans because of something. So there are lots of ways to improve horses' muscle with amino acids and that kind of thing. But unfortunately, there are some feeds with creatine in it, but it's not doing anything. So just as a little side note for you guys.
That is super interesting because I've looked up some things related to dogs, but I have not looked up that one related to dogs. We
Yeah,
have bird
you should
hunting
check.
dogs. Yeah. So, but they do have some interesting metabolism. Side note again, but dogs use protein as their energy source, whereas humans don't use that as an
Oh,
energy source. So
okay.
that's why a lot of dog food is really high protein.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah, so just different metabolisms. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to talk a little bit too about muscle growth. So you mentioned that. So I kind of mentioned on like the phosphocreatine stores and that baseline values. Muscle growth is a huge thing that you'll see on all creatine supplements too, right? It's like increased muscle mass, increased lean mass, et cetera, right? And so this is why a lot of our 20-year-old males are drawn to using creatine. So there's
Mm-hmm.
a couple different mechanisms that lead to this muscle growth that can happen with creatine supplements. One is that you're trying to increase your lean body mass. So this is like muscle as well as like connective tissue, organs, ligaments, all of that. And it has been shown to increase lean body mass. One reason is creatine increases the water retention in the muscles. So your muscles will retain more water. Um, yes, this obviously leads to some swelling, which is usually seen in muscle growth. So when our muscles swell because they're filling with water and retaining water, this actually stimulates muscle cells to continue growing. So they're swelling, but they're also continuing to grow, and that's just a stimulation that happens. The
Mm-hmm.
other aspect of it is regulating your body temperature. So basically, the more water you have in those muscles, when your body temperature increases during exercise, which it always will, even if it's, cold outside, it allows you a better ability to cool those muscles down. And we're always trying to cool everything down because as we increase our body temp, our body becomes more acidic, which impairs our performance. So we usually don't perform as well. We get more fatigued. And so having that water within those muscles, because the creatine is helping retain that water, is going to help you become less acidic when you're exercising.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then obviously muscle growth helps with muscle strength. So therefore, if you have that, you're hopefully going to be stronger. They do see better results when creatine is combined with exercise. So I think this is just important to note if someone is like on vacation or recovering from an injury, for some reason they're not able to exercise or not able to exercise much, they probably won't see as big of a benefit with creatine compared to like those that are in a full exercise routine.
Exercising. Yeah. Yeah. And so let's just talk a little bit about times in our life where we would want more muscle growth. So I know women are terrified of gaining weight and getting bulky, but as we age, research shows that we're losing muscle mass at a very alarming rate if we're not doing something to counteract that. So
Yeah.
get to, your postmenopausal years or even your perimenopausal years, you want to have as much lean body mass in the form of muscle as you can.
Yes. And I will say that they usually don't, there is some bloating and like side effects, which we'll get into later with creatine. But as far as like weight gain, most of the studies don't necessarily see a difference in weight. They just
Hmm.
see a difference in like the proportion of fat mass versus fat-free mass with the creatine supplements. So I don't think overall weight is likely to change that much,
Hmm.
unless you're drastically increasing your muscle mass for other reasons. And there are a few studies too that look at inflammation as women age, so postmenopausal specifically,
Hmm.
that since we obviously are losing muscle mass, so we're trying to counteract that with all of the aspects. And then inflammation. So when we have decreased muscle mass or and our ability is decreased, we actually usually increase general inflammation within the body. So
Interesting.
there are, yeah, so there are a few studies looking at like creatine supplementation in postmenopausal women and actually having decreased inflammation.
Which makes total sense because the more muscle you have, the less fat mass you
Yeah,
have, less inflammation.
a lot more coming out that's like really specifically looking at that. Um,
Hmm.
because obviously like joint pain, like all these things that end up from inflammation is a
Hmm.
huge concern for people.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you for diving into that. That's really cool. So, how
And
do
then
we Oh, sorry, what was
you're
that?
good. No, I just wanted to comment on another thing too, which is kind of an interesting and just a sex difference between males and females for creatine. They find that males and females actually get similar, like the same benefits and the same degree of benefits for strength, speed, and muscular endurance, but women don't have as much of a muscle mass gain that men do with creatine. And this
Okay,
is at like all ages.
interesting.
Yeah.
So, in your research, have you come across anything that talks about brain health with creatine? So, there's this guy that it's I don't know how to pronounce his name, so I'm not going to butcher it, but I can put it in the show notes. But he talks about studies that show that creatine improves memory and cognition and even offsets some of the harms of sleep deprivation. That's amazing. Is that something that you found consistent in the research?
So it's kind of interesting. I think I know who you're talking about. And the counteracting the sleep is interesting because it does acutely, but it doesn't chronically. So if
Oh,
someone has like really good sleep and they just have like poor sleep one night and then take creatine the next morning, it's shown to counteract it, especially for like cognitive work. So like if you're doing exams, anything that requires some brain power, but they
hmm.
show it doesn't if you're like chronically having sleep deprivation.
Okay.
So it
So,
might be helpful for those, especially who are like traveling for rodeo or trail rides and things like that. But if you're
mhm.
like chronically a poor sleeper, it probably is not going to be as beneficial.
Okay. Yeah, I know 100% of our people that rodeo are sleep deprived, because I know that. But it's on the weekends usually. So maybe not necessarily chronic, but yes, definitely those nights of 4 hours of sleep and then driving to another rodeo and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I do think it would be like beneficial in that aspect if it's like something that's not consistent. So you're not someone that's like always suffering from like sleep deprivation or poor sleep or anything like that, but it does show like acutely that it does. So um could be beneficial for some of them.
Yeah. So it sounds like it increases muscle mass, lean muscle mass. It can be beneficial for your brain and sleep deprivation in some cases,
Yep.
and helps with temperature regulation.
Yep.
Is there anything else, any other benefits that people can expect from taking creatine?
I mean, I think that if you are training, potentially competing, but even if your training is just like exercise or trail riding, anything like that. You might not be doing rodeo events per se, but I think it is really helpful as far as recovery goes. And some people might see that if they look it up, it'll say improved recovery.
Hmm.
And part of that improved recovery is replacing those phosphocreatine stores and getting
Okay.
back up to baseline. Because
Hmm.
as we keep continuously bring them down, so say we're like working or preparing for our horse, etc., if we don't replace those stores, you're just going to be more and more fatigued and therefore like not recovering.
Hmm.
Um, and so when people are looking at that as far as like recovery, and some people are using it specifically for that, like they might have short-term turnarounds, right? Or you might have multiple rodeo events in a day or a weekend. Anytime where you're going to have short turnaround, then I would say it's even more helpful for that
Hmm.
recovery piece and replacing those phosphocreatine stores because you only have so much time to eat and you only have so much time to try to maximize those stores, especially if you're traveling, etc.
Hmm.
So it can definitely improve recovery, especially with those short-term turnaround times.
Okay. And yeah, that's something that I've talked to like almost all of my riders about is when they start one of our exercise programs, a lot of times it's the first time they've ever worked out on consecutive days. And, we never work out the same muscle groups on every day, but they might still be sore Wednesday from Monday's workout, that kind of thing. And so I have them start supplementing with creatine, and it is an absolute game changer in my population. So women who horseback ride total game changer for recovery.
Well, and it's kind of interesting because a lot of like college age kids that I talk to don't really notice the difference. And I think it's just mostly because they're like 20 years old and
Hmm.
can have no sleep and everything. But as I've talked to more and more women who use creatine, that's like the primary reason they use it is for the recovery piece. And that's like
Hmm.
their favorite aspect of it. Like it's not even like the muscle mass gains or anything like that or the performance gains. It's like literally the recovery for it.
Yeah. And actually, I just have a question for you because I've noticed that as I've gotten older, my soreness lasts longer. Is that something that as we age, like, can you just talk about
Yeah.
that for a
So
second?
Yeah, so basically that is just because we're constantly like resisting any like anabolic gains. So because as we age, our body just is literally resistant to like muscle mass gain. And so
Okay.
part of it is just like you don't recover as quickly because it's constantly trying to like resist against it. And it's
Oh.
just a natural thing that happens like as we age.
Hmm.
And women are a little bit more susceptible just because of like lower testosterone levels as well
Hmm.
than males. So women usually experience that as well.
Okay. Thank you for touching on that. Because, yeah, I just think that's fascinating. I used to like go in high school and I'd go ski all weekend and then play sports. And, like I was just fine. And now I ski and if I'm not working out, my legs are super, super sore for a couple days.
Yeah, and I think another thing is interesting too is like the more responsibilities you have, like the more fatigued you are in general. So also like, if you're like running around for work or you're like taking care of cattle or horses and like all these things that you maybe didn't do when you were 16 or you didn't do as many of them when you were 16 or you're taking care of your kid, like even though it's like not exercise focused, you still are like fatigued from it. And so
Hmm.
I feel like the older we get, the more that we have more of those responsibilities and like therefore the more fatigued we are and we just aren't recovering as quickly because you were running around taking care of a kid or,
Hmm.
taking care of your horses and all of those things. And you might not needed to do that when you were like 16.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's get back to talking about like the actual creatine supplement. How do we get creatine in our body?
Yes. So our body actually makes creatine in addition to us consuming it. So 50% of it is actually made within our body. So 50% of the creatine that's in our body we make.
Okay.
It's made by the liver, pancreas, and kidneys. Um, and so And then, and like a fun fact too is just that like if we're not consuming much food that has creatine in it, our body actually adapts and starts making more. So if we are just not consuming it for whatever reason, our body will compensate for that, but only to a certain degree. And the problem with that is because then people can be like, oh, it doesn't matter what I eat. Like I can just eat whatever if my body's just going to make up for it. The problem with that is when your body is making it, it's making it from stored body protein that's already inside of you. So it's not making
And
it
we
from
don't
like
want to take
dietary.
away from that.
Yeah, yeah, it could take away muscle mass, like bone tissue, like anything like that. It's going to take it from other areas enzymes, antibodies. It's going to take it from somewhere to make up for that, which we don't want.
Okay.
um, yeah. So there is a compensation. That being said, like obviously, if you have some low protein days, things like that, um, your body can make up for it. But long term or consistently. Um, and it's mainly from animal sources. So red meat is really high in creatine, fish, poultry, eggs, dairy. Tofu has a little bit, and that's probably the highest source as far as like plant foods.
Hmm.
But so the main people that really struggle to get creatine from food sources are people that are vegetarian or vegan, especially if you're vegan and not consuming any dairy or egg products. Um, Eggs are a great source of creatine. And then creatine supplements, obviously, is another aspect of that. Um, and we have studied lots of different types of creatine as well. So there are different types. The most common one that you'll see is creatine monohydrate. That's the most studied, it's the safest, it's pretty much the main one you'll see if you look for a creatine supplement.
Hmm.
Um, but just in addition to those, and we have seen that like even if people are consuming really high amounts of animal products and thus consuming food that has really high levels of creatine in it, it still might not like make up or replace all of those phosphocreatine stores that we have. So actually, if you're doing a lot of like high intensity or like really short movements, like short, fast movements,
Hmm.
even just like while you're on your horse, getting your horse for 10 seconds or less. And I feel like a lot of people who are working with horses are also occurring, like having those movements occur, or your horse like sees something and quickly like runs. Like any of those high intensity movements are going to be using those phosphocreatine stores.
Hmm.
So it's always a good idea to make sure that you're topping off and that you're really like increasing those baseline stores. And creatine supplements are cheap, they're relatively cheap. So it's a good way to just like fill in any of the gaps in your diet that you might be having.
Yeah, and making sure that your body's not going to break down more protein in your
Yeah.
body. It's already so hard to build protein or build muscle after, 30.
Yeah, exactly. I know. So that's when it becomes even more important.
Hmm.
And I will say, like, a lot of women under the age of 30 might not necessarily notice a difference compared to those post 30
Hmm.
women as well,
Yeah.
just because of the age factor.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so speaking about 30-year-olds, let's talk about pregnancy because I think that this is something that is really interesting to talk about in a time when your baby is taking everything from you.
Yeah,
So if you just want to
so
talk about
much.
that.
Yes. And so there isn't like an official recommendation about like creatine supplementation during pregnancy, just because they likely haven't studied it. Like there's probably not a lot of pregnant women out there taking creatine for them to study. But pretty much every source is like it's likely safe. Like, of course, there could be the rare thing. And depending like if you have a normal pregnancy, there's no concerns. There are some benefits to taking creatine during pregnancy. So fetal brain development, and it's also been shown to decrease fetal injury during delivery. So, which
Interesting.
is super interesting finding.
Yeah.
But it's obviously the baby is taking a lot of your creatine stores as well to grow.
Hmm.
So it's a time you're already susceptible since they're literally consuming pretty much all of your nutrients.
Hmm.
Um, but it seems to be very, very safe. The only thing that is kind of like warned is they do tell you that it's helpful if you try it pre-pregnancy,
Okay.
just so you know any side effects and like any symptoms so that you're not associating it with your pregnancy. So you can kind of
Hmm.
differentiate between those like creatine symptoms you might have and the like pregnancy symptoms you might have.
Hmm.
Because if you just start taking it for the first time during pregnancy, it can be really hard to know where those symptoms are coming from. And then
Hmm.
that makes it really hard when you're trying to discuss things like with your provider and try to like combat symptoms.
Hmm.
So even if you tried it like a couple years before you were pregnant, that's still like better than never trying it. um, and I doubt it would, I haven't read anything about like conception and creatine, so I don't think that's like necessarily a concern.
Yeah, I haven't read anything about conception and creatine either, but I'm just thinking about the toll that birth takes on your body,
Oh, yeah.
whether you have a vaginal delivery or a C-section. And with us talking about recovery after, I can only imagine how important that would be to speeding your recovery up after. So, of course, I didn't know anything about creatine when I had WIT, and so I didn't use it. But I wish I had because it's birth is such a demanding process on your body, and then you're
Yeah.
responsible for this little baby that doesn't sleep and doesn't and cries all the time, and you have to feed it all the time. And I guess that'll probably take us into breastfeeding to talk about that. But yeah, I can imagine that postpartum is probably a really important time for anybody that's looking to maximize their recovery to be taking something like creatine.
And it's kind of interesting because in the literature, obviously it's kind of like limited in the subgroup, but there was generally a lot more positive towards taking creatine during pregnancy than breastfeeding. Or I could
Uh-huh.
say there's like more concern with breastfeeding, and taking creatine during that time. Obviously, if you're not breastfeeding, then definitely take it. The concern with when you're taking it when you're breastfeeding is that obviously the infant is then drinking your milk, and human breast milk is about 9% creatine already, so it is pretty high in creatine.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore obviously infants are used to ingesting creatine. It's not like a new thing that they normally wouldn't be exposed to as an infant. The only
Mm-hmm.
concern is like it could potentially impact like kidney function in infants.
Oh,
There's definitely women who have taken it breastfeeding. Um, I think it just depends too on the infant and whether that infant already has kidney concerns or anything
mm-hmm.
that's an issue. Um, Another thing you could try to is just taking lower dosages. So maybe
Mm-hmm.
you're used to taking higher dosages, but just taking lower dosages
Okay.
during breastfeeding is especially when they're only breastfeeding. Like there's no other like food or supplement that they're getting and they're just primarily on breast milk. I
Mm-hmm.
would probably be cautious and just take a lower dose than you would. Therefore, you'd still have the benefits from it. And like I said, they're already consuming creatine. It's just you don't want to all of a sudden be taking like 10 grams a day of creatine. And then
Mm-hmm.
that's a huge dose. Um, so you obviously wouldn't want to take like a loading dose, but there is like
Yeah.
more concern about it breastfeeding, but I
Okay.
think just because of lack of info on
Uh-huh.
that. So,
Yeah, that's so interesting. That's it's kind of surprising that it would be safe during pregnancy, but less research based for say or less research supported for breastfeeding. Um,
yeah. And I
but
think part of that is that they're always like extra cautious with like fetal
mhm,
outcomes.
absolutely.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I think that's just like one main reason. And I think it would be hard to study because you wouldn't be able to prescribe a postpartum breastfeeding woman to take creatine to see what happens with their
Hmm.
fetus, right? You'd only have to be, you could only collect data on women that are already taking creatine and breastfeeding, which is
Hmm.
a small population of people.
Hmm.
And, um, people are very concerned about what they're consuming when they're breastfeeding or can be concerned. So people, really try to like limit what they're consuming breastfeeding too.
Hmm.
And so I think it's just a really hard group to study. And that's the main
Yeah.
reason that they're overly concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about creatine for women and aging.
Yes. So they are like the research is really blowing up with like premenopausal, during menopause, and postmenopausal, and supporting creatine supplementation for women. Like there's a huge support for like higher protein at that point in your life, as well as creatine supplementation. And I would say creatine probably is like the most studied supplement for women entering menopause or menopause
Hmm.
time. Haven't seen a lot of other supplements that have showed positive impacts. Um, and they still see that women like postmenopausal and during menopause still gain like strength and speed and muscular endurance with creatine. So just the similar effects that we see when people are younger with creatine, we see the same things as they age, which
Hmm.
isn't always the case. Um,
With other supplements.
Yeah, like a lot of times we might not see any change, right? Like age just takes over and kind of mitigates any effect that we would see.
Hmm.
Um, and so creatine is one of the few supplements for postmenopausal that we do see changes still.
Hmm. Yeah,
Because
and improvements in strength, speed, and muscular endurance, those are all things that we need as horseback riders. Like all three of those are things that you need to be working on to be able to ride your horse the best you can and also to stay safe up there.
yeah, and they definitely get harder as we age. So if we can have like any nutritional change, obviously we will always see like an abdominal weight gain usually in older women. And this is just because of the low estrogen that suddenly happens. So even if women are exercising, even if they're exercising more than they ever have, and their diet is great and all of these things, they'll still usually retain more fat around the abdominal area
Mm-hmm.
once we hit that menopause time, just because of low estrogen. Um, and there's not much we can really do to mitigate that per se. Obviously, we can mitigate the volume of it that we gain, but it's just a new area of storage.
Mm-hmm.
And creatine is like one of the few nutritional things that older women can do to try to like help improve this like strength and speed. Strength and speed is obviously, especially speed, is really hard as you
Mm-hmm.
age, as everyone ages, males included. Speed does not go up usually, and it's really hard to maintain speed. I feel like even in my 30s, I'm like, oh my God, this is like hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard to run fast. And so I think that's a huge difference in the fact that the females that are postmenopausal, we can still see the same benefit as like males that are that age. Is pretty impressive because usually we don't see a lot of equal improvements between males and females. Usually males are improving at a larger degree than females just because of the hormonal influences with everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's one of the few supplements and interventions that we do see the same degree of benefit.
And I have heard that so many times where women will say, like, we started a diet at the same time as my husband, and he's he has lost so much more weight than me, or I started a workout program at the same time as my husband, and he looks like he's been working out for 6 months, and I look like I haven't stepped foot in a gym. And so it sounds like creatine is kind of like an equalizer a little bit, where it can help women fill that gap that the hormones aren't going to fill for you.
Yes, it is. It really is like the equalizer. Like it is the besides the muscle mass uh differences. So we do see that women don't gain as much muscle mass as males with creatine, but yet they're still improving to the same degree for strength, speed, and endurance, which is like
Mhm.
pretty impressive that they're actually gaining less muscle mass than males, but they're still able to improve their strength and speed at the same level.
Which
Like
is
it's
like
kind of
music to
counterintuitive.
everybody's ears because
Yeah.
nobody, like we talked about with the stereotypes, nobody wants to be a bulky, bodybuilder type, but they want
Yeah.
the benefits of being stronger, faster, and having better endurance.
Yeah. And that's what you usually see too. Women don't just like drastically gain muscle mass when they're taking creatine.
Hmm.
Um, you know, uh, but we do still see those increases.
Hmm. Very cool. Okay, so let's talk about the dosage, timing, and some symptoms. So, we talked about how 10 grams would be like maybe like a loading dose, but I know that one of my supplements is 2.3 grams per scoop, and the other one is, I think it's three, if I'm remembering right. But I know that the dosage is just different. And maybe if you could just talk about that.
Yes, for sure. I think this is like one of the most interesting areas because women definitely experience very different symptoms than men who are taking creatine, which is one reason why women have also like strayed away from taking creatine, especially if they've had a poor experience. So women are definitely way more symptomatic than men with creatine. Men usually have like few to no side effects with it. And then there's definitely women who have no side effects as well, but in general, more women experience some side effects.
Hmm.
So one of the main ones, especially when this is when you can have weight gain, is because sometimes people will initially experience some bloating and like water retention. And it's not necessarily water retention within the muscles, but just general water retention. So some
Hmm.
people will feel like really, really full or like fluffy feeling is a common symptom that people will like women will discuss. And
Hmm.
obviously, no one wants to feel fluffy, especially if you're exercising. It's definitely not comfortable. It usually does go away though. So it usually starts to decrease around week 4 or 5 of using the supplement. Obviously, that's a long time. You pretty much have to take it for like a month, slightly over.
Hmm.
And normally those symptoms should all go away. But a lot of times when people experience that, they're like, oh my gosh, I've been using this for a week or two and I'm like retaining water. They might have gained like 5 pounds in water weight, right? 5 pounds in water weight isn't actually that much. But it feels like a lot when it's happening to
Mm-hmm.
you. And so I really encourage everyone to try to like get past that point and hopefully you return back to normal. Obviously, if you hit week 6 and you're like, I'm still feeling the same, maybe it's not for you. Maybe you can change your dosage, etc. when you take it. But those are usually the main complaints women have of it. And usually this is like all ages. It's like 16-year-olds all the way up have like similar experiences to this. Did you have any symptoms when you started taking creatine?
I don't think so. My biggest symptom still when I take it is that I'm thirstier. So
Mm,
I do drink more water. But usually that comes in the form of like I'll put it in my coffee in the morning. And then I just notice maybe like around noon or maybe a little bit before that that I'm really thirsty. And on the days that I don't take it, I don't have that. But I have not had any of the negative effects of feeling full or fluffy. I had the exact opposite. Like I felt so strong and I still feel strong when I take it. And like it was the first time in my since I had WIT that I was able to actually put muscle on my legs, which was like a huge deal to me. So I didn't have the negative side effects.
that's good. Yeah. I've encountered several women too that have had that feeling like they feel super strong. They feel like they can like recover really quickly, like during their workouts. So in their
Hmm.
like rest periods. And they felt really, really strong and they still had some of these symptoms of just feeling like bloated and really full, but they still had like positive symptoms at the same time going on, which is kind of interesting. But I do try to get people to like try to go through a full month before they go off of it if
Hmm.
they experience these symptoms. Um, and then some people will have digestive issues. I haven't encountered tons of people. It's just kind of a side effect. And if someone's like really sensitive to supplements and like medications and food in general, they might have a discomfort with digestive issues. They say that if you have any digestive issues, to just go down to a lower dose. And so even if it's like a really small dose of like zero point 0.5 grams or something, go down to a really small dose and then just like really slowly ramp up,
Okay.
which is kind of similar to anything else you're doing if you have a negative digestive response. Women specifically, they recommend not to do a loading phase. So basically, what a loading phase means is that people take a high dose of creatine for like 5 to 7 days to just try to really quickly saturate those muscles with phosphocreatine stores. Um, a lot of males do this. It's not, you don't have to do it. Like lots of people never do a loading phase and it's fine. I think it's really popular for young males to want to do a loading dose. It sounds like really fun and it sounds like they're just going to like drastically improve after you like saturate these muscles, but that's like not really how it works. You can see improvements and it's definitely a thing you can do, but I
Hmm.
don't think it's like mandatory for people that are just trying to exercise, perform, ride their horse, even if you're a competitive rodeoer, I don't think it's necessary to do a loading phase. Um,
Okay.
and so unless it's just like you're doing one event ever, but you're likely rodeoing multiple different times. So you want to do
Hmm.
good in all of your rodeos, not just like one. Um,
Yeah, exactly. The peak season for any horseback rider, at least up here in the northern states, is like the whole summer. So you don't want
yeah,
to peak
yeah,
out.
you're not just like looking for just one week in June or something.
Hmm.
So, and then a lot of times too, when people do experience negative side effects, it's during a loading phase. Did you do
Okay.
a loading phase at all when you started taking creatine?
No, I didn't.
Yeah. So which kind of makes sense because you're taking like double the dose. You're taking a really high dose. So it kind of makes sense that this is when people are going to be the most symptomatic.
Hmm.
So usually they recommend most women just skip the loading dose and don't do that at all, even if like their supplement has directions for it. They just tell you to like skip it.
Hmm.
Um, and then most maintenance doses are around 3 to 5 grams per day. So you said one of yours was like 2.5 and the other one was like around 3.
Yeah, and then I know the naked protein, that's one I recommend to a lot of my riders because it's super cheap on Amazon. That one is 5 grams a scoop.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So yeah, anywhere between that is fine. It just kind of is a personal preference. But 3 to 5 grams is usually what's recommended for women.
okay. And so that's something that I've heard this from multiple sources that you are supposed to take every day, even if you're not exercising that day. Is that right?
Correct. Yep. So you want to you definitely want to take it every single day, even if you're not exercising on those days. But hopefully you're exercising on like the next day, etc.
Hmm.
And then so you said you take your creatine in the morning, right? With your coffee?
I do. I can't even taste it, so I just put it in my coffee. It's right. Like I have my Keurig, my creatine, and then I usually do some Fairlife protein in there.
Nice. Discussion in the literature about like when is the best time to take creatine because they basically looked at the literature and research like okay, people we clearly see all these great benefits from creatine, but could we like further maximize it if we like took it at specific times?
Mhm.
Like how can we easily manipulate this? And so for most times, it doesn't matter when you take it during the day, as long as you take it at some point. So the timing is less important compared to like other things as far as like consuming carbohydrates and protein. But they usually do tell you to take it consistently. So if you're going to take it every morning, take it every morning. Don't just like randomly switch to like, I'm going to take it in the evening today. So try to be consistent. That's what they found the most changes with is always take it in the morning or you always take it at night or you always take it at lunch. Um, and then there are benefits to taking it like when you exercise. But usually you just like to take it in the day before you exercise. So if you're going to exercise at noon, you want to make sure to take it sometime before noon, anytime.
Okay. So that's so interesting that it really doesn't matter, you know, and maybe you could talk really quickly about this. I know that's not the scope of this particular episode, but we've talked about the window of time that you have after a workout to consume protein and carbohydrates.
Hmm.
Creatine, it's cool that it doesn't follow that, that you can you can really take it anytime that day, and it still is beneficial.
Yeah, and I find that a lot of women, the consistency part of it, because that it's interesting because a lot of times most supplements and like other nutrients taking it at the same time every day isn't really an impact. Like I feel like the main thing that you can take every day is like birth control, right? If you're on an oral contraceptive.
Hmm.
But creatine is kind of the same way, where you just want to take it at the same time every day. Um, and so it's almost like your body is like compensating because it knows it's going to get that creatine at the same time every day
Hmm.
versus having to like break down other proteins. At least that's my theory behind it. And so because it's expecting it every single day. And I found that in the literature, most of the time in most research studies, they have people take it in the morning,
Okay.
just like first thing in the morning.
Hmm. Yeah, it doesn't taste like anything, so you can mix it in whatever, drink you have or I sound like a
Because like you're
creatine
gonna
rep or something. I have no tie to any creatine companies. It just has made such a huge difference in my muscle building that I am really passionate about it.
no, that's so cool. And they do see it too that like when the first month you're on it, so again, this is like the most symptomatic month as well. But they do say that the timing, the main time that it makes a difference is the first month. So if people are taking it for the very first month ever, this might be the time where you'd want to consume it after your exercise, if that's something that you're really trying to time for, or you're really trying to like notice if you have an impact. So
Hmm.
it's kind of unique in that aspect as well, is that the first month is when you do notice some timing differences. But then after that first month, your muscles are usually so saturated with creatine. And since you're consistently taking it now, they're maintaining their full saturation of creatine. So the timing of like when you take it during the day doesn't impact it near as much as like when you first start taking the supplement.
Okay. Okay, very cool. Well, Allie, do you have anything else that you want to share with us about your research on creatine and just what you have found either clinically or in teaching or within the research?
Well, I will say one thing to just touch on what I said in the beginning is that like I personally don't take creatine. And a lot of the college students ask me that because they're like, well, what about all of this info you just said? And then you don't even take it. And I will say the reason I don't take it is because I am focusing on events and activities that last way, way longer than 10 seconds. And a lot of times I'll be going on runs that last like 10 to 12 hours and things like that. And I think if I had a child, I would definitely try taking creatine during pregnancy and probably breastfeeding to some degree, just during that time of growth and change. And then I think if I focus on any like shorter events, I'd be really interested in seeing the difference. And definitely like as I age, I'm definitely interested in it. I
Hmm.
haven't noticed a ton of muscle mass loss yet. Fingers crossed. But I'm sure I will at some point. And so I would definitely be super interested in consuming it then. But I just have a lot of people that are like, but you don't even take it. And I haven't had any negative experience or anything like that. I'm just not doing the activity that I would like to look to, that I would likely see a difference. Because even if I did see some muscle mass differences, I don't know if it would be enough performance wise, um, that I would focus on this person. Kind of throw that out there because it is kind of interesting, but I do think it is a very fun, interesting supplement to try and at least see if it works, see if it
Hmm.
doesn't, um, see if you like it, especially as you're aging. Um, I think it's an easy way. They're very affordable supplements, which is nice. Um, I think it's a very easy way to try to get a little edge up on aging and still do all the activities that we want to do.
Which is the goal for everybody. I mean, yeah, we all want to be able to do everything that we could do in our teens and 20s. And I just really appreciate you taking the time to research this and talk to our audience about it and answer all of my questions.
For sure. Thank you so much. It was such a joy being on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ali, if anybody wants to get a hold of you for like nutrition questions or consultation, anything like that, how can they get a hold of you?
I will give you my email to put in the show notes, but they can reach me at Ali, ALI dot WOLPERN at umwestern.edu.
All right, sounds good. We'll put that in the show notes. And thank you again for helping us out on the Solid and Settle podcast.
Absolutely.
All
Thank
right.
you so much.
Yep. Have a great rest of your day, Ali.
You too.